Hey there, this is Don Davis with the Happy Lab and also the Center for Stress, Trauma, and Resilience. I'm going to be going over um, how to conduct a systematic literature review, especially a qualitative review, and we'll provide some additional training later on how to do a meta-analysis. Um, the main difference will be with a meta-analysis. Um, the coding of articles has a lot more detail, and you actually need certain software programs to run the analyses quantitatively. So number one, why is it important to learn to write a systematic literature review? So I actually think this being able to write this kind of paper, a strong uh, literature review, is probably one of the most important potential contributions to your career as an academic. Um, I mean, one somewhat superficial reason is there are two kinds of papers that get cited the most in psychology. One is review papers, because anytime somebody writes a paper on a topic, often in the introduction they'll um, kind of cover some broad strokes in the literature, and the review papers are what get cited for that. And then also measurement papers, because every time someone uses a measure, it gets cited. So that gets used as an indication of your influence on your discipline. And so um, this is a way to kind of ensure that you're making investments in areas where you're going to do well on that metric. Um, More substantially, I've actually noticed that the times when I've done a strong literature review, it often gives me enough ideas and kind of shapes and energizes the next line of work for me. So when I did a master's thesis and I did a review there, it probably led to 10 to 15 publications on spirituality and forgiveness. And the literature review I did on humility has basically led to multiple grants and the line of work um, that I will kind of put up for tenure on humility. So, yeah, I think it's critical set of skills. And it also kind of advances your expertise in methodology. So when you see what other people are doing and kind of have a higher level understanding of some of the gaps in other people's work, um, it strengthens your own work. So you get more out of the empirical work that you do. So, um, so number two, resources. So I have a variety of things that I think would be helpful. Ev has a dissertation manual that has a nice discussion of how to do a systematic lit review. Josh is really practical, so his would be really helpful when you kind of sit down to actually do this. There's an article by BIM on how to write an article for Psych Bulletin. And then I think one of the best ways to kind of get a sense of how to write a strong review is just to read different reviews and read reviews in some of your areas of interest. If you use like Google Scholar and see some of the reviews that have been massively cited. There's one on social belonging by Roy Baumeister and Mark Leary. Um, you'll see what it looks like for kind of world class scholars to write a review. Um, okay, so this is just an overview of the different steps, and I'm kind of just describing my process. So this is a little bit different than what Josh kind of describes. But I'd read through all three of these. So kind of my summary, Josh's and Ev's, and I think it'll give you a general sense of how you might want to approach this. But I will say, I think it really does help to just kind of break it into practical steps, because there are several parts of this that are just easy to do. It's pretty straightforward. You could even kind of mentor someone to help you and do some of the legwork on this. And then there's one key part that really just takes some momentum to kind of push through. So anyway, so first of all, let's just see where the bar is. What does it take to publish a strong review? Some of the key aspects have to do with you have to do a rigorous search. So there's certain methodologies that are considered stronger. Some of that has to do with the degree to which you really made an effort to find everything that was out there. So you're never going to find everything, but have you done kind of an adequate job based on scientific standards to find most everything? And so some of that involves kind of systematic searches on PsycInfo. Google Scholar's much better. There's kind of looking at dissertations, asking people for unpublished work, but all of this is kind of to establish strong rigor. And then the other part is not just summarizing the studies, but kind of having some sort of story or main point that is going to kind of catalyze research, future research, and push the field forward theoretically. So to publish it somewhere like Psychological Bulletin, you kind of have to pull it all together. So we talked a little bit about it, conducting a comprehensive search. So you're seeking to establish that you made a good faith effort to find everything, all the empirical work in an area. So look through those examples I described and just kind of see how those searches are described. The next part is you need some way of kind of documenting what you actually did in your search, because later on when you write the method section, you'll need to go back and kind of document exactly what you did so that someone else could replicate it. And what I usually do, and I'll demonstrate this later in a screenshot video, is I'll actually export that search from PsycInfo into a file that EndNote can read, and I'll actually output that information into several columns in an Excel document: author, year, journal and title, and then an abstract. And I'll kind of use that to take notes. So it saves a ton of time to kind of use some of those software programs to keep track of what you're doing. So the next step is I'll read through all the abstracts and just get a general sense of what's out there in the literature. And at this point, I may not have even kind of finalized my search because I'm not quite sure kind of how to narrow things. But I'll basically read through, and in one column, I'll kind of keep a 1 or 2 word code that I can sort by. So, for example, studies on religion and forgiveness, I might kind of document that certain studies focused on religious commitment versus others maybe focused on spiritual well-being. And then I'll also just keep general notes of ideas that I have as I'm reading, because I'll forget all of that thinking unless I document it somehow. So yeah, step 4 is, once I've kind of discerned the focus of the review and what I'm going to use as kind of inclusion and exclusion criteria, I'll pull the full text articles and kind of put them in so I have one folder per paper, and I'll have a subfolder within that called articles, and then I'll save each article based on a certain format. So I'll do year first, and then the first author's last name, and then a couple of words of the title, just in case the person has several articles within the same year. And then, so this step takes the most time, and if you don't have some sort of system for this, you'll repeat a lot of work. But I'll basically go through and read every article and take notes on it, usually in a Word document. So often I'll just kind of create an outline. I'll summarize the participants, the measures, any notes on the procedure, and then I'll kind of bullet point any critiques that I have of the article. And kind of at the same time, I'll start working on a summary table. So most articles that publish qualitative literature reviews will have a summary table of, so it summarizes the method of each study, and that saves you a little bit of time sometimes in having to go through and write out um, lots and lots of details describing every study. So if you put that all in a table, then the reader, you don't necessarily have to rehash all of that in describing every study. You can kind of focus on the elements that are important for your critique. So once you finish that part, this is the part, in my opinion, that's the hardest. So this step 6. So you're kind of wanting to work towards some sort of outline of the paper, and to this point, any undergraduate could do what you've done so far, but we're about to do something that involves kind of the shift into scientific thinking and analysis. So I generally go over the key sections of the paper here, and this is fairly self-explanatory, but what I want to kind of skip to is the crux of the paper has to do with how you're going to organize the results section. And it's worth mentioning. So the reason why people read reviews is it saves a ton of time instead of just reading a bunch of primary studies and kind of feeling overwhelmed. If you can read a strong expert's perspective on the literature, even if you disagree with it, it gives you kind of a bucket to kind of organize all of the primary studies, and it's a real shortcut in terms of kind of streamlining your learning. So, if you're trying to get to know a new area, read a review first before you read all the primary studies, and it'll kind of help you have some buckets to organize what you're reading. So with that in mind, what you're really looking for is when there are inconsistencies in findings, that's where the real thinking kind of starts. And there's really only 3 reasons why you might have inconsistent findings. So you can remember it with STP, subjects, treatments, and procedure. That's basically the layout of a method section of an empirical paper. So something might be different in the sample, something might be different about how the constructs were measured, or something might be different in how the study was conducted, just in terms of procedural elements. And this matches kind of categories of moderators in a meta-analysis. So this is where I've kind of had the most struggle, and it took me a while to kind of figure out how to push past this stage. But what I'll typically do is I'll look at the table, and I'll look for, it's easy to kind of find consistent findings, and so I'll look for those, but I'll also ask myself if there are any major gaps in terms of STP, in terms of studies not looking at certain samples or not using certain measurement approaches or study designs, like no experimental or longitudinal studies. But really where you have a chance to kind of hang the main story of your paper is when there are some discrepancies in findings, because that gives you a chance to use theory and prior research to try to help explain what's going on. And again, think back to your STP. The other thing I do is I'll kind of look across the samples in general to in terms of STP. So what level of sophistication is there in the literature in terms of strategic sampling versus convenient sampling? Looking at the measures, is there any reason to think that findings might be different if the field had state-of-the-art measurement approaches? And similar kind of thing in terms of study design. So do you see maturity and use of a variety of methods, including designs that allow strong causal inferences? And so basically, once I can kind of struggle through getting a potential outline for this section, usually at that point I can kind of lay out the rest of the paper. The discussion section in a qualitative review is sometimes separate, kind of like an empirical article, but sometimes you'll see people blend in the results and discussion. So they'll kind of review empirical work that pertains to a certain hypothesis, and then they'll kind of relate things back to the prior theory and empirical research. So a final note just on kind of how to push past. So what I have learned I have to do is basically at some point I just have to start writing, and it's going to be messy, and I'll usually just kind of outline things and kind of put some bullet points in and then expand on those. But I'm just okay with the fact that it's going to be a little bit messy, and I don't even worry about typos or whether things would make sense to somebody else. I just try to get my thoughts on the page. But once I have a reasonably strong kind of draft of the crux of the paper, which I'm saying is that results section, then I can kind of work to lay out the rest of the paper. And then, I think the other thing I'd say is if you talk to most prolific writers, they tend to have to rewrite things quite a bit. And I usually think of this as being several distinct phases of revision. So one phase involves just looking at the manuscript and seeing if the organizational structure makes sense, kind of at the paragraph level. One level has to do with within paragraphs, just seeing if there's coherence. Does the first sentence kind of give a general sense of what the point of the paragraph is? Cutting out unnecessary words, jargon, trying to be as clear as possible. So all those things that some of the classic books on writing talk about. And then the last phase, I'll do kind of my OCD hat, and I'll try to catch every single error I can before I let somebody else see my work. And that last phase for me requires some management. I don't really like doing that, but you don't want to send people sloppy work, and you definitely, when you submit articles to a journal, want your work to be pretty as polished as you can, because it's an indication of kind of the rigor in your scientific work. People are going to draw inferences about how detail-oriented you are. So bottom line is I have to give myself permission not to be in that phase because, if I've got my OCD brain on while I'm trying to lay out ideas and lay out an argument, it ends up stifling and slowing me down. And I'll just kind of save that for a last phase.